Hello. Today what we're going to do is to talk about data connections in Spotfire. I've been having a few conversations with customers about data connections that aren't what we would call native drivers or native connectors in Spotfire. So I guess really what I'm going to have a conversation about is using other methods to be able to connect directly to these data sources without you having to go and manually export this data every time from whatever system you're trying to access. So the first thing I want to talk about is when we do these data connections, most of these will be established from a desktop client, which is Spotfire Desktop, which is the standalone without a server. You have your cloud analyst, which is the current popular product, and then the traditional Spotfire analyst where the server is being hosted by yourself. So I'm going to discuss three ways to connect to data. This assumes that the data source you have either has a native connector, an ODBC driver, or a JDBC. If not, then it's probably a web service that communicates with REST APIs or some sort of API web service, in which case that's a different conversation than what we're going to talk about today. Those can be connected to in Spotfire, but requires different ways to go about that. So the first thing I want to point out is which clients can do what and when is a good time to use it. The good idea to think about is if I want to directly connect to a data source, mostly all your typical SQL relational databases are going to be having native connectors and a few others as well. The goal is if we have a native connector, which is listed on the site, I'll give the link soon enough, you want to use that native connector. Now, the native connectors can be used and created a data source in any of the clients available. Now, if there is not a native connector to a system you're trying to go for, maybe a new data source or something that hasn't been established and supported through a native connector quite yet within Spotfire, the way to do that is to create what's called a custom ODBC driver. And so that's actually what I'm going to demonstrate in this demo today, is working with that ODBC driver. And the reason why is because it's also supported on any client. Now, an ODBC driver is a Windows file or application that translates data into a readable format for any tool, such as Spotfire or any other tool out there. So ODBC essentially is a little application that takes the data from the source and moves it and translates it so that we can actually read it. So I'm actually going to show you how to create one of those connections today. The other alternative is what we would call a JDBC, which is more of a Java-based driver. That is used more for Java applications, and really the only reason you would be able to use JDBC is making a server connection through an information link, which is setting up connections for large groups of people. If you have the cloud analyst or a desktop, JDBC currently is not usable through those clients. Hopefully that changes in the future for the cloud analyst. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and go to a demonstration. So what we're going to talk about is talking about actually finding these ODBC drivers. We're going to talk about creating that ODBC connection within Windows or wherever that analyst or desktop client is downloaded. And then we're actually going to make a connection in Spotfire. So I'll walk through the whole process. So the first thing I want to talk about is the websites where you can find all this information, which I'll include in the links of my video or in the comments of the video. So the first thing I want to point out is the native connectors. So this is going to be listed at this site here, and you can go through and see all the different ones that we have available. And typically all that requires is a link to a site for you to download something on your client, and it would show up as a native connector. I'll show you where these are listed when I actually open up Spotfire. Now what we're actually going to demonstrate today is working with ODBC connections. We have a page on how to work with ODBC data sources. Things that you need to know, such as are there differences between the native connectors and a generic ODBC? What things are you going to lose and how that should be done? So how do you find these ODBC drivers? So let's take an example of a very popular data source. So in this case, I've really seen a lot of people asking about Snowflake recently. It's been more of a popular one. So if people want to be able to connect to Snowflake, which we all know is a cloud data source for big data, you're going to want to look for their ODBC driver, which you can go to their documentation or just go straight to the download. And all you need to do is download that to your application, and we're going to take that in an example used later. Now, most drivers are free for many databases, but there are going to be a few that aren't free for certain applications or cloud-hosted services, in which case you may have to pay for it. An example of a company that is very popular for drivers is CData. They have a ton of different ones. For example, I had a customer yesterday asking about Intact, being able to pull information there. Typically, you're not going to find a free connector for ODBC for a source like that. So being able to take that driver and download it, you would have to go through them. But they have tons of different connectors, and they're used quite frequently by some of my customers. The last one was JDBC, which we covered, which has all the details. We have a separate site just to deal with those. And as a reminder, only if you have the Spotfire server is that beneficial. So let's actually go through the process of creating an ODBC connection. So when you open up Spotfire, what's going to happen is you're going to see all those native connectors. Now, they're going to be grayed out if you have not downloaded that driver, which means you need to go to the link that I mentioned to download it. Otherwise, typically out of the box, I think there's only 3 or 4 that start blue, and then you have to go and find them. So we'll come back to this a little sooner, but first we need to talk about creating that custom ODBC connection. So assuming that you've already downloaded the ODBC driver. In this case, I downloaded a driver for a KDB Plus application, which is a time series server. What you're going to do is go to your menu and type in ODBC. Now you're going to notice 2 different ones. There's a 32-bit and a 64-bit. Looking at the documentation of the ODBC driver you downloaded, obviously you want to be able to find the one that matches. In this case, the driver I downloaded is 64, so I'm going to go to that. Now, typically you want to click on the system DSN to create these connections. Now, you can see I've created a couple of these on my own, and I have some sample ones that are included for the use case of the application. So I'm just going to go ahead and add a new one. Now, if everything went the way it should and you actually downloaded the ODBC driver, you ran the installer, that installer is going to show in this list. In this case, the one I installed was the KDB. So I'm just going to click Finish. Normally something will pop up that wants you to enter your credentials. I'm not going to do that because the info I have is a customer's, so I'm just going to use the one that's already created. So when you've entered that information, you just click OK, you click OK, and you commit to that. So now you have a new ODBC connection that you can use in Spotfire. So once you've created that, the next step is to click Other. And when you add a data source, you're going to scroll down all the way to where it says Database, so Other Database. So the thing I want to point out here before I go any further is that the user interface you're looking at is pre-Spotfire 10. This is going to be Spotfire 7.11 that I'm using. So keep that in mind, that things might look a little different if you're using Spotfire 10 or after. In that case, typically the data panels, there's going to be a big plus button. There's going to be 3 big buttons here. On the left, you're going to click the plus button and navigate similarly through that system. So when we get to this point, we're going to click on an ODBC data provider and click configure. Now you're just going to choose that connection, which I'm going to use the customer one. If you didn't put a login, now would be the time to do that. If you didn't do that on the ODBC level, since I already did, I can just click OK and click OK. And you're going to notice that my tables have already populated within the data store. And so now I can write my SQL statement, or I can select tables that I want to bring in, and I would give that data source a name, and we would just click OK. So the last thing I want to point out is now that you've made that data connection, you'll now be able to load and work with that data in Spotfire. Now, I mentioned earlier 3 different clients. If you don't know which client is the one that you have, the key to that, it's going to make me exit that, is to go to Help, About TIBCO Spotfire, and it will tell you. So if it's cloud, it will say Cloud Analyst. Mine is a server version, so it'll just say Analyst, but if you're a standalone desktop, it will say Spotfire Desktop. So this will tell you which version you have and which one you would be able to use and strategies as far as connecting the data. So I just wanted to summarize what we did today was went through a custom data connection using an ODBC driver, which allows you to directly connect to data without having to manually download from a certain source. So if you're tired of doing that manual upload, this is the way to do it. We discussed how that would be done through the desktop client or the thick client for Analyst or Spotfire Desktop. And we went through that entire process. Of course, if you ever have any other questions or things you guys want to know about, please leave a message on the YouTube page. Thank you today.